Certified case files. Genuine evidence. Objective truth. You are viewing Bodycam incident reports.
Thursday, 7:45 p.m. The fading Texas sun cast long, heavy shadows across State Highway 195 in Bell County, just a few miles outside the sprawling perimeter of Fort Cavazos. The heat of the day was still radiating off the cracked asphalt. Driving southbound in a spotless late-model Ford F-15 was Stephen West. At 42, Stephen was a solidly built black man with a close-cropped haircut and tired eyes. He was dressed plainly in a black unmarked t-shirt, dark denim jeans, and scuffed work boots. He looked like any other contractor heading home after a long shift. In reality, he was Major Stephen West, a special agent with the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division, or CID. He was a federal investigator whose job was hunting down the Army's most dangerous criminals and testifying in courts-martial. But tonight, Stephen just wanted to get back to his hotel. He had his cruise control locked precisely at the 65-mile-per-hour speed limit. Both hands rested comfortably on the steering wheel. Before we watch this arrogant, overstepping deputy permanently destroy his own career over a fabricated traffic stop, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what city or state you're watching from today. The Major was listening to a low-volume sports radio broadcast, enjoying the rare quiet of his unmarked fleet vehicle, completely unaware that he had just entered the crosshairs of a local predator. Sitting idle in a dusty Chevrolet Tahoe patrol SUV, tucked discreetly behind a cluster of dry mesquite bushes on the median, was Bell County Deputy Sheriff Ronald Barnes. Barnes was a man who operated his stretch of highway like a personal fiefdom. He wasn't looking for drunk drivers or reckless speeders. He was looking for easy targets. He profiled cars, and more importantly, he profiled the people driving them. As the CID agent's pristine F-150 cruised past the median, Barnes narrowed his eyes. He noted the generic out-of-county fleet license plates. He noted the slight factory tint on the windows. And then, as the truck passed his hiding spot, he noted the race of the driver. In Barnes's deeply ingrained, biased mental calculus, a black man in a plain t-shirt driving a brand new $70,000 truck wasn't a military officer or a successful civilian. He was a red flag. He was a potential asset forfeiture waiting to happen. Barnes slammed his Tahoe into drive, kicking up a cloud of red Texas dust as he aggressively merged onto the highway. He accelerated hard, eating up the distance until his heavy push bumper was riding dangerously close to the tailgate of the Ford. It was a classic intimidation tactic designed to make a nervous driver swerve, speed up, or tap their brakes, anything to provide a legal excuse for a traffic stop. The Major didn't flinch. His heart rate didn't elevate. He checked his rearview mirror, noted the aggressive positioning of the patrol vehicle, and maintained his exact speed and lane position. He had spent 2 decades in law enforcement. He recognized a fishing expedition the second it started. Furious that his intimidation tactic had failed, Barnes needed a pretext. He stared at the back of the Ford F-150 until he found the weakest, most heavily abused loophole in the state traffic code. The black plastic dealership frame surrounding the truck's license plate slightly obscured the word Texas at the very bottom. It was an incredibly petty, virtually meaningless infraction, but it was all Barnes needed to legally initiate a stop. He reached down and activated his overhead lights. Inside the quiet cab of the truck, Stephen let out a slow, exhausted sigh. The flashing red and blue lights painted the interior of his cabin. He didn't curse or scramble to hide anything. He simply activated his right turn signal, reduced his speed, and guided the heavy truck onto the wide gravel shoulder. He shifted the truck into park and turned off the engine. With deliberate, highly practiced movements, he rolled down all 4 windows of the cab to completely eliminate any shadows or blind spots for the approaching deputy. He took his keys out of the ignition and placed them visibly on the dashboard. Finally, he placed both of his empty hands flat on the top of the steering wheel, sitting in absolute chilling silence as he waited for Deputy Barnes to walk into a trap of his own making. The heavy crunch of tactical boots on gravel announced Deputy Barnes's approach. He walked with a wide, arrogant swagger, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered Glock. Following standard procedure, he firmly pressed his thumb against the F-150's rear taillight, leaving a smudge to prove he had been at the vehicle. He stepped up to the driver's side window, pulling a heavy tactical flashlight from his belt. He shined the blinding LED beam directly into the cab, fully expecting to catch a panicked driver shoving something under the seat. Instead, the beam illuminated a masterclass in de-escalation. All 4 windows were down. The Major's hands were empty and planted firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. The keys were sitting in plain sight on the dashboard. It was the exact procedure a seasoned cop uses when pulled over, designed to eliminate any claims of furtive movements. The deputy didn't see it as professional courtesy. To his prejudiced mind, it was a display of calculated defiance. It irritated him. "Evening," Barnes said, his voice dripping with condescension. He didn't state his name or agency. He leaned heavily against the door frame, invading the cabin's space. "Driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance." "My license is in my right rear pocket," Stephen replied. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, utterly devoid of the nervous tremor the deputy was used to hearing. "My registration is in the center console." "I am going to reach for my wallet now." The patrolman's jaw tightened. The driver was narrating his movements to prevent a misunderstanding, another law enforcement tactic. Stephen slowly retrieved his wallet with exactly 2 fingers, pulled out his standard-issue driver's license, and handed it through the window. Barnes took the card, shining his light on the plastic, then back at Stephen's face. "Stephen," the deputy said, intentionally using the driver's first name to establish authority. "You know why I pulled you over tonight?" "I do not," Stephen answered simply. He didn't offer a guess. He didn't apologize. He gave the deputy absolutely nothing to work with. "The plastic frame around your license plate," Barnes stated, tapping the roof of the truck with his flashlight. "It's covering the bottom half of the word Texas. That's an obstructed tag. It's a violation of the transportation code." It was a laughable textbook pretext. Stephen knew it. But you don't argue case law on the side of a dark highway. "I understand," the major said, looking straight ahead. The lack of argument frustrated Barnes. The standard script wasn't working. He decided to start the fishing expedition, looking for any excuse to initiate an asset forfeiture or a vehicle search. "Pretty nice truck for a guy just passing through," the deputy probed, his eyes scanning the immaculate interior, looking for stray cash, empty bottles, or anything suspicious. "What kind of work do you do, Stephen, to afford a $70,000 rig like this?" "I work for the government," Stephen replied evenly. "Is that right?" Barnes sneered, clearly not believing him. He figured the man was either lying or a low-level clerk. "Where are you heading at this hour?" "To my hotel." "You carrying any large amounts of currency in this vehicle? Any weapons? Anything illegal?" "No," Stephen said. One word, absolute finality. Barnes was completely stonewalled. The driver wasn't sweating, wasn't stuttering, and wasn't providing conflicting stories. He was a brick wall. The patrolman realized he wasn't going to get a consensual search or a slip-up. If he wanted to tear this truck apart and put this arrogant driver in his place, he was going to have to manufacture the probable cause himself. Barnes clicked off his flashlight. He leaned his head slightly further into the open window and took a long, exaggerated sniff of the air inside the cabin. Stephen recognized the physical cue instantly. His stomach went cold. He knew exactly what lie was coming next. "Well, Stephen, we have a problem," Barnes said, a dark, triumphant smile spreading across his face. Because I am detecting the distinct odor of marijuana coming from inside this vehicle. It was the oldest trick in the book, entirely subjective, impossible to disprove on a dash cam, and often used to justify a warrantless search. The major turned his head, finally locking eyes with the deputy. The look Stephen gave him was so heavy, so intensely analytical, that Barnes actually took a half step back. Stephen wasn't looking at a police officer anymore. He was looking at a suspect committing a federal civil rights violation. Stephen West did not break eye contact with the deputy. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't show a shred of panic. Instead, he slightly raised his chin, projecting his deep voice so that the microphone on the deputy's uniform would pick up every single syllable with crystal clarity. "Deputy," Stephen stated, his tone as cold and hard as concrete. "There is absolutely no marijuana in this vehicle. Furthermore, I do not consent to any searches of this truck or my personal property." Barnes let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. He stepped back from the door, resting his hand firmly on his duty belt. In his mind, he had already won. He had invoked the magic words that gave him absolute authority over the vehicle and its driver. "I'm not asking for your permission, Stephen," the patrolman said, his voice hardening into a direct command. "The odor of narcotics gives me probable cause to search this vehicle. Now, unbuckle your seatbelt with your left hand, open the door with your right, and step outside." Legally, under Pennsylvania versus Mims, an officer has the right to order a driver out of a vehicle during a traffic stop. But using a fabricated odor to conduct a warrantless search and detain the driver was a serious Fourth Amendment violation. Stephen knew the case law intimately. He also knew that the shoulder of a dark Texas highway was not the place to fight a man with a badge and a gun. Stephen complied with perfect practice precision. He unclicked his seatbelt, pulled the door handle, and stepped out onto the dusty asphalt. Standing at his full height on the shoulder of the highway, Stephen was a couple of inches taller and significantly broader than the patrolman. Barnes instinctively took a half step back, his hand hovering dangerously close to his holster. He hadn't expected the driver to be this physically imposing. To compensate for his sudden spike of insecurity, the deputy immediately escalated his use of force. "Turn around and face the truck. Put your hands behind your back," Barnes barked, unclipping the metal handcuffs from his belt. Stephen didn't argue. He turned his back to the deputy, laced his fingers together, and placed them at the small of his back. The patrolman grabbed Stephen's wrists roughly, yanking his arms upward to cause a sharp flare of discomfort. The cold steel bracelets clamped down hard against Stephen's skin. Barnes squeezed the cuffs tight, locking the ratchets with a sharp, metallic click-click. "You are being detained while I conduct a probable cause search of your vehicle," the deputy announced, giving Stephen a quick, aggressive pat-down for weapons. Finding nothing but a hotel keycard and a cell phone, Barnes grabbed the major by the bicep and marched him toward the front of the Chevrolet Tahoe. He practically shoved Stephen against the heavy metal push bumper of the cruiser, forcing him to stand directly in the blinding glare of the headlights and the unblinking lens of the dashboard camera. "Do not move from this spot," Barnes ordered, pointing a rigid finger at Stephen's chest. "I won't," Stephen replied quietly. His face was an emotionless mask, but behind his dark eyes, a predator was quietly watching its prey walk into a snare. By placing a federal agent in handcuffs based on a fabricated lie, Barnes had just crossed into felony territory. The deputy turned his back on the handcuffed man and walked eagerly toward the open door of the Ford F-150. He pulled out his flashlight, ready to tear the pristine interior apart. He was absolutely certain he was about to find something that would justify his profiling and secure a lucrative asset forfeiture for his department. He had no idea he was about to pry open a box that would end his life as a police officer. Bathed in the harsh, strobing glare of the Tahoe's light bar, Stephen West stood perfectly still. His hands were bound tightly behind his back, the steel handcuffs biting into his wrists. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead on the dark Texas horizon, allowing the cruiser's dashboard camera to record his absolute, non-threatening compliance. 30 feet away, Deputy Barnes was tearing through the cab of the Ford F-150. Fueled by adrenaline and confirmation bias, the patrolman ripped open the center console, tossing charging cables and mints onto the passenger's seat. He jammed his flashlight under the driver's seat, checked the glove compartment, and ran his hands along the floorboards. There was no loose cash, there were no plastic baggies, and there was absolutely no smell of raw marijuana. Frustration began to crack through Barnes's arrogant facade. The manufactured probable cause was failing to produce actual contraband. Desperate to justify the handcuffs he had just slapped on the driver, the deputy yanked open the rear passenger door. Sitting dead center on the back bench was a black, heavy-duty Pelican case. Barnes's eyes lit up. To a proactive cop on a fishing expedition, a reinforced, waterproof, locked case in a rental vehicle was the holy grail. It was the exact kind of container used to transport bulk narcotics, unregistered firearms, or illicit cash. The case was secured with a thick steel padlock. Legally, even with the fabricated smell of marijuana, breaking into a locked, secured container required a warrant in many jurisdictions. But Barnes was already too deep into his own lie. He drew a heavy tactical pry tool from his duty belt, wedged the thick steel tip into the padlock's shackle, and threw his weight against it. With a sharp, violent snap, the metal lock broke. Barnes tossed the broken padlock onto the floor mat. He flipped the heavy plastic latches upward and threw open the lid of the case, shining his high-lumen flashlight directly inside. He was expecting the ultimate bust, the kind of seizure that would get his picture in the local paper. Instead, the beam of his flashlight hit a block of custom-cut, high-density foam. Resting perfectly inside the precise cutouts was a matte black Glock 19 sidearm. Beside the weapon was a thick-sealed manila folder stamped with a bold red warning. Department of Defense, sensitive compartmented information. And nestled in the center cutout was a heavy black leather credentials wallet. The air in the deputy's lungs suddenly turned to ice. A cold, creeping dread began to spread down his spine. His hands, which had been moving with aggressive speed just seconds before, were now trembling slightly as he reached down and flipped the leather wallet open. The flashlight beam reflected off a massive, solid gold shield. It wasn't a local police badge. It wasn't a state trooper star. It was the gleaming, undeniable crest of the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. Above the eagle, etched in deep black enamel, were the words, Special Agent. Pinned to the opposite side of the leather flap was a federal identification card. The photo matched the man currently standing in handcuffs in front of the cruiser. The rank printed next to the name read, Major. Barnes stopped breathing. The flashlight slipped in his sweaty palm, the beam shaking erratically across the federal credentials. His brain violently misfired as the catastrophic reality of the situation crashed down on him. The man he had just racially profiled, illegally detained, and handcuffed on the side of a dirt highway wasn't a drug runner. He was a major in the CID. He was a senior federal investigator with the Department of Defense. A man whose entire career was dedicated to dismantling criminal enterprises and prosecuting federal offenses. And Barnes had just broken into his secure government case based on a completely fabricated lie about smelling weed. The officer safety excuse was useless. The probable cause was dead. By forcing that lock, the deputy had just committed a blatant, undeniable federal civil rights violation. And he had done it all while his own dash cam was recording the entire sequence of events. Barnes slowly lowered the lid of the Pelican case. His hands were shaking so badly, he couldn't even snap the plastic latches back into place. He backed out of the truck and gently pushed the rear door shut, treating the metal handle as if it were a live grenade. Slowly, the patrolman turned around and looked toward the front of his cruiser. Stephen West was still standing there in the flashing lights, staring directly into the lens of the dash cam, waiting. He hadn't moved an inch. He didn't need to. He had already won. Deputy Ronald Barnes walked back toward the front of his police cruiser. His heavy boots seemed to drag against the asphalt. The arrogant chest-puff swagger he had displayed just minutes earlier was completely gone, replaced by the pale, rigid posture of a man walking to his own execution. He stopped a few feet away from the major. The patrolman reached with trembling fingers toward his duty belt, pulling out a small metal handcuff key. He forced a weak, incredibly nervous smile onto his face, desperately trying to de-escalate the catastrophic trap he had just sprung on himself. "Look, Stephen, sir," the deputy stammered, his voice entirely stripped of its previous authority. He took a hesitant step forward, holding up the key. "Looks like we had a little misunderstanding. I cleared the back seat. I'm going to take these cuffs off, give you a warning for the license plate frame, and let you get on your way." He reached out to unlock the steel bracelets. "Do not touch these handcuffs," Stephen West commanded. He didn't yell. The volume of his deep baritone voice didn't rise a single decibel, but the absolute razor-sharp authority in his tone caused the patrolman to freeze mid-step, his hand hovering in the air. "You do not have my consent to remove these restraints," Stephen stated, his eyes locked dead onto the terrified deputy. He was acutely aware of the dash cam's microphone, recording every syllable. "You detain me under the guise of a fabricated odor. You then use that unlawful detention to bypass my explicit denial of consent, conduct a warrantless search of my vehicle, and break open a secured Department of Defense case." The deputy swallowed hard, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Sir, please, I was just doing my job." "You made a deliberate choice," Stephen corrected him coldly. "Step back from me and call your watch commander to this location immediately." "Do it now." For a second, the patrolman looked like he might argue, but the sheer, immovable presence of the federal investigator crushed any remaining resistance. Defeated, he slowly stepped back, reached for the radio mic clipped to his shoulder, and requested a supervisor to his location. The next 15 minutes were an agonizing, silent purgatory. Stephen stood perfectly still in front of the cruiser, his hands bound behind his back, waiting. The patrolman paced nervously in the dusty grass of the median, unable to make eye contact with the man he had profiled. Finally, a white Tahoe with supervisor markings pulled onto the gravel shoulder. Lieutenant Miller, a seasoned watch commander for the sheriff's department, stepped out. He took one look at the tense scene, his pale, sweating deputy pacing in the dirt, and a sharply dressed, completely composed black man standing in handcuffs in front of the dash cam. "Barnes, what the hell is going on here?" Lieutenant Miller barked, walking briskly toward the cruiser. "Why is this man cuffed?" Before the deputy could stammer out a lie, Stephen spoke. "Lieutenant," the major said, his voice carrying clearly over the highway noise, "I am Major Stephen West, Criminal Investigation Division. Your deputy initiated a pretextual traffic stop, unlawfully detained me in handcuffs without probable cause, and broke into a locked federal container against my explicit recorded denial of consent." Lieutenant Miller stopped in his tracks. He looked at Stephen, absorbing the federal title and the flawless legal terminology. Then he whipped his head around to glare at his patrolman. The sheer panic in the deputy's eyes confirmed every single word the CID agent had just said. "Barnes," the lieutenant said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying whisper. "Did you force open a locked case?" The patrolman opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just gave a small, pathetic nod. Lieutenant Miller closed his eyes for a brief second, realizing the department was about to be hit with a massive, indefensible federal lawsuit. He immediately walked up to Stephen, pulled his own handcuff key, and unlocked the steel restraints. "Major West, I profoundly apologize for this," Lieutenant Miller said quickly, taking the cuffs off. "This is not how this county operates." Stephen slowly brought his arms forward, rubbing his wrists. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten them with violence. He simply delivered the procedural death blow. "Apologies do not amend constitutional violations, Lieutenant," Stephen replied smoothly. "I am formally requesting that you preserve all dash camera and body camera footage of this interaction. My office and the Department of Justice will be contacting the sheriff tomorrow morning to collect the recordings and file a formal complaint for deprivation of rights under color of law." Stephen turned, adjusted the collar of his black t-shirt, and walked back to his Ford F-150. He didn't look back. He started the engine, smoothly merged back onto the interstate, and left Deputy Ronald Barnes standing on the gravel shoulder, completely paralyzed, realizing he had just thrown his entire life away for a fabricated traffic violation. Talk about picking the absolute worst target for a power trip. Do you think Deputy Barnes deserved to lose his badge for this illegal search, or should he get a second chance? Drop your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one. If you love seeing arrogant cops face real, undeniable legal consequences, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the next video on your screen right now. Stay safe out there.
Case officially closed. For more authentic law enforcement footage, please leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for joining Bodycam Incident Reports.